Before we dive into today's episode, please note the views and opinions shared by our guest are entirely his or her own and do not reflect the positions of any organization with which he or she may be affiliated, past or present. All insights represent his or her personal perspectives only.
Hi, welcome and grüezi to a new episode of Governance Unplugged. Today's episode is about something that almost every organization claims to do, but far fewer truly use in a way that creates strategic value. The title of today's episode is therefore Modern Risk Management Must Drive Better Decisions. As you all know, organizations today are navigating an environment shaped by volatility, interdependencies, rapid change, and a constant uncertainty. In that context, risk management should not be a backward-looking control exercise or a compliance ritual. It should help leadership teams make better decisions earlier, more consciously, and with greater clarity. But that is exactly where many organizations still struggle. Too often, risk management gets lost in registers, score models, reporting templates, and beautiful constructed quantifications that suggest a level of certainty the real world simply doesn't offer. Outside the risk function, leaders often struggle to translate those numbers into meaningful choices. What remains is a system that produces reports and comfort, but not always insights, clarity, or better decisions. So, what should modern risk management really look like if it's supposed to support strategy, resilience, and leadership judgment in a truly meaningful way? I'm Thomas Michel, your host with 25 years of experience in senior positions in internal audit and risk management at the Big Four firms, as well as in my former role as the head of internal audit and risk management at the World Economic Forum. To help us to explore this important topic in more depth, I'm delighted to welcome someone who has been shaping the field of enterprise risk management through research, teaching, and most importantly, practical experience for many years. Today I'm joined by Professor Dr. Stefan Hunziker, Professor for Risk Management at the Lucerne University of Applied Science and Arts, and one of the leading academic and practical voices in enterprise risk management in the country. Stefan is the head of the Competence Center for Risk and Compliance Management, head of research at the Institute of Financial Services Zug, and long-standing lecturer, researcher, and program leader in the area of enterprise risk management, internal control systems, and the interaction between governance functions. He is the author of several important publications, including Enterprise Risk Management, Modern Approaches to Balance Risk and Rewards, Risk Management in 10 Steps, and works on internal control system and integrated governance. Beyond academia, Stefan also serves as an advisory board member at the Swiss GRC and has played a key role in advancing the professional dialogue around risk management in Switzerland for many, many years. Having that said, Stefan, welcome to Governance Unplugged.
Thomas, thank you. Really great to be here. And I think the episode's title really gets to the heart of the issue, because for me, the fundamental question in our field is surprisingly unresolved. Does risk management actually change decisions? And if it doesn't, Thomas, we should seriously ask what it is for.
What a great start, Stefan. But before we dive into today's topic, usually I like to ask two rather light-hearted questions. Would that be okay for you, Stefan?
Of course, okay. Thomas, go ahead.
Okay, then let me fire it at you. So, number one, what is something people might be surprised to learn that you really enjoy outside of your work?
Interesting question, Thomas. That's actually not something most people expect. If I hadn't gone into risk management, I probably would have studied medicine, because I've always been fascinated how the human body works, but also how decisions are made under uncertainty. In a way, those two things are not so far apart.
That is truly interesting, Stefan. I didn't know that. And the second question I would like to ask you, what helps you to reset best after an intensive week? Nature, sport, family time, music, or anything else?
Thomas, for me, I think the most important reset is definitely running, specifically trail running. When you're out for a longer run in the mountains, you really step away from, like, let's say, structured thinking, from models, all the frameworks, and constant decision pressure. And interestingly, that's often when things become clearer for me again. So many ideas actually come during those runs, not at the desk here. And then secondly, of course, family. That's where you really disconnect and regain also perspective. So for me, it's probably those two things: running to clear up my mind, and family to remember what actually matters.
Thank you so much, Stefan. So let's start with the main part of our conversation. Stefan, before we go into tools and frameworks, very simple question. Why should organization invest seriously in risk management in the first place? What makes it critical for a long-term success and resilience of an organization?
Great question, Thomas. So I think at its core, risk management is about improving decisions under uncertainty. That sounds pretty simple, but if you look at how decisions are actually made in organizations, so many of them rely on assumptions that remain mainly implicit. So take a typical investment decision, for example. So it's based on assumptions about demand, pricing costs, regulation, maybe even technology developments. But those assumptions are rarely made fully explicit, and even less often, in my experience, systematically challenged. And this is not just true for investment decisions, it applies to any major strategic choice: entering a new market, for example, launching a product, restructuring an organization. So the assumptions are always there. The question is whether they are visible, Thomas, or invisible. And invisible assumptions are the ones that cause the real damage, not because the decision was wrong, but maybe because nobody asked the right questions before making the decision. So if you ask me again, risk management should make those assumptions visible and also transparent, and then push back on them. And once you do that, the conversation absolutely changes. You start asking questions like, what if they're wrong? How much does the outcome actually change if one key driver moves in the wrong direction? So in my opinion, the ultimate purpose of risk management is not to predict the future. That's a common misunderstanding. Its real value lies in improving how organizations think about uncertainty when making decisions.
If risk management is so important, Stefan, why do so many organizations still struggle to turn it into something that genuinely helps leaders making better decisions? From your perspective, where does risk management most often fall short in practice?
Thomas, now you're getting to the core of the problem. Many organizations have become, let's say, very professional in their approach to risk management. They have well-defined processes, structured risk registers, the heat maps, they have reporting cycles. Everything looks quite mature. But professionalism and documentation is not the same as effectiveness. So I think the core issue is that risk management often focuses on rather artifacts than impact. You know what I mean? So in risk management, for example, process quality is often mistaken for the impact of decisions. And this becomes very visible in how risk management is actually implemented in practice. Risk registers document risks, of course. Heat maps visualize them. Maturity model assess the process and so forth. But none of these tells us whether a decision was actually made better, Thomas. And that's where it becomes interesting. I sometimes ask a very simple question. Can you point to a strategic decision that was changed because of risk management? And surprisingly often, the answer is not very clear or even no. I remember, for example, working with a mid-sized company here in Switzerland that had invested heavily in its risk management setup. So they created a beautifully structured risk register, quarterly risk reporting, a dedicated risk function. And then when I asked the CFO whether a recent acquisition decision had been influenced by any of that risk management work, he paused, Thomas, and then said, not really. We had already decided before the risk team got involved. And that moment, Thomas, stayed with me because it captured the real problem. Not effort, that's not the issue, but timing and also relevance. And if you push that logic a bit further, I sometimes go even further and say if an organization removed its risk register tomorrow, let's just assume that for a moment, the quality of its strategic decisions might not suffer at all. And in some cases might even improve, not because the documentation is useless, but because the risk register creates a false sense of completeness. So you look at the list, you see 25 risks or 30 or even more. Everything rated and categorized nicely, and somewhere in the room, someone relaxes. But the risks that have actually caused the most serious damage in organizations were rarely or never on a risk register, Thomas. So they were the assumptions nobody questioned, the dependencies nobody mapped, and the slow shifts out there nobody took seriously because they didn't fit in the format actually. So the risk register is not the problem. It's more the comfort it creates. That's a huge problem in practice, I think.
So, Stefan, if a CEO or a CFO is listening to this conversation
Mhm.
and suddenly realizes, hey, that their risk management function is producing processes, as you just described, but not really influencing decisions, what would be the first practical change you would recommend they make first thing tomorrow morning?
Great question, Thomas. So let me think about that for a second. So honestly, the first step is probably simpler than most people expect. So let's just pick one upcoming strategic decision to illustrate this and explicitly bring uncertainty into that discussion. So take an investment or an acquisition or any major initiative that is currently being prepared. Instead of reviewing it as a single business case with one expected outcome, as it's usually done, ask, for example, these 3 questions. What needs to be true for this to work? Simple question. Second, where are we most uncertain? And third, how sensitive is the outcome if key assumptions change? That alone changes the conversation immediately because risk management moves from like a separate report into the actual decision process. And in parallel, I would probably stop asking for a top risk list. That might surprise some listeners, and instead ask for one-page view on our key uncertainties behind that specific decision. And that's something I think you can do just tomorrow morning without changing any risk management framework, Thomas.
That's very good insight. I think that's a great advice here. So if I continue with the next question, Stefan, many organizations still rely heavily on risk registers and heat maps. Where do these tools fail short, and what should risk management look like when it truly supports strategy, uncertainty, and tough leadership choices?
Yeah, in my experience, let's put it directly, I have never seen a board make a strategic decision based on just a heat map. Honestly, not. Never. Decisions are made based on business cases, strategic alternatives, competitive positioning, but definitely not by pointing to a red or orange box on a heat map. Seriously not. So I'll be very direct in that sense. So a risk register is a filing system, maybe. It tells you what people have like documented. It does never tell you what actually matters for the decision. And the heat map is, let's say, a communication tool. Yeah, it can be useful, maybe in a workshop, but the moment it becomes the key deliverable of the risk management, that this is very common. The thing you present to the board, something has gone wrong, Thomas, seriously gone wrong. Because a board looking at the heat map is not making a decision. It's approving maybe a risk categorization approach, and those are totally different things. So the more useful starting point is simply this. What needs to be true for this strategy to work? And once you ask that question seriously, the risk conversation changes and then becomes immediately more relevant. So because suddenly you're talking about the assumptions that actually drive that decision, that specific decision. And that is where risk management becomes decision relevant, I think.
So maybe a question in between here. You talk about risk heat maps. I know you are a big fan of tornado models to demonstrate or to illustrate your risk. So do you think there's any difference between the quality or the value of a risk heat map compared to illustrating your risks in a tornado model?
Great question, Thomas. These are two totally different tools. So the heat map is just showing like point estimates, so risks as point estimates. So it's just one outcome. They do not show uncertainty actually. That's a huge issue. So this is totally counterintuitive what uncertainty really is, because uncertainty is always expressed in ranges. And the tornado diagram just show these uncertainties with the means of these ranges rather than just using point estimates in a heat map that never actually depict the correct risk or uncertainty behind that risk. So that's why I think it's far more better approach to use these tornado diagrams, showing true uncertainty rather than just having point estimates on a heat map. True risks, actually.
Interesting. So executives often say risk reporting is either too detailed to be useful or too abstract to be actionable.
Mm.
What does truly decision-relevant risk reporting look like in practice? What is your experience, or what are your thoughts or recommendations?
I'm really a fan of that topic, Thomas. Thank you for bringing this up, because I think executives are rarely lacking information. So what they often lack is more information that is, let's say, directly usable for decisions. So a typical risk report might say cyber risk is high or supply chain risk is increasing. But what does that help? It doesn't help much if you're deciding whether to invest, insure, or change your strategy. So what decision relevant reporting does is take one step further. It actually translates uncertainty into business impact. So instead of having like a vague label, you might say a ransomware attack could shut down operations for several days. A typical loss might be in the low millions range, and in a severe scenario, it's significantly higher. So often the real issue is bigger than the cleanup cost because the strategic and reputational consequences can be much more severe. That immediately leads to a real conversation about whether the exposure is acceptable, whether you need more controls, or whether you transfer part of the risk to an insurer, for example. And I think one important element here is transparency about uncertainty. Instead of presenting a single number, heat maps, again, good risk management works with ranges. Risks are ranges. And with confidence levels. Not as a weakness, don't get me wrong, but as a more honest reflection of reality. So, because in the end, decisions are not made on numbers alone. Let's be honest. They're made on how those numbers are interpreted in a certain context. And that's a crucial task of a good risk manager, I think.
Could you give us a simple example of how the same risk would be reported in a traditional way versus in a truly decision relevant way, so that listeners maybe can immediately understand the difference that you're talking about?
Sure. I think a simple way to illustrate the difference is to take the same risk and look at how it typically is reported. So in a traditional format, you might see something like cyber risk, high impact, medium likelihood on a heat map, for example, in a red zone or in an orange zone. So that gives you like a label, a qualitative label, but it doesn't really help you to decide anything. So in a more decision relevant format, it could look more like a short extract from a management report. For example, a ransomware attack could disrupt operations for 3 to 5 days, for example. A typical financial impact might be in the range of, in Switzerland, 2 to 5 million Swiss francs. And in a severe scenario, maybe even significantly higher. So you might also attach a rough probability range, but with a clear note that this is an orientation, not a precise forecast and not a precise number. So what actually matters, in my opinion, is that the exposure is meaningful enough for management to explicitly address rather than treat it as a remote technical issue, So, and that's where the key difference comes in, because now this type of information is directly linked to decisions. So management can, for example, can ask, is this within our risk appetite? Do we invest more in prevention? Do we transfer maybe part of the risk to an insurance company? Or do we simply accept it? So the real shift is now from qualitative to quantitative. It's from more abstract, qualitative, colorful labels to decision-relevant narratives and information. That's such a huge step, a simple but a huge step forward. And quantification plays an important role there, but only if it's embedded in context, only if you have a good narrative in place, and only, and Thomas, this is the most important step, only if it's clearly linked to a certain decision.
And Stefan, you bring me right to the next topic I wanted to ask you. So from my side, thank you for that. Many organizations are attracted to quantified risk frameworks because they promise precision, objectivity, and rigor. But in practice, do they sometimes make risk management harder for management and boards to interpret? Where does quantification add value, and where can it become more of a distraction?
Yeah, that's such a fundamental question. an important one and often a very misunderstood one in academia, but also in practice. So I think generally quantification is incredibly powerful. And in the right context, it adds true value. So when we deal with, for example, stable systems, recurring patterns, subject matter experts, and have sufficient data, it helps us structure uncertainty. So it makes it more comparable. But the challenge, I think, arises with the risks that matter most. So, for example, many strategic risks are shaped by structural change, for example, and by very limited data. You just don't have the data. And that's where a common misconception comes in practice specifically. So we tend to believe, and that is completely wrong, that if something is quantified, it's just objective. It gets objective automatically. But in reality, even sophisticated risk models are built just on assumptions, on expert judgment, on past data, and often on incomplete data and information. So quantification can also create a dangerous impression of precision. It's just not fully justified. And you can see this very clearly in practice. So, for example, what I often observe is that data starts to dominate the discussion. So everything is just revolving around data availability. That's the wrong question. A risk with clean historical data gets a lot of attention, even if it's relatively small. So while a strategically critical risk is treated as secondary simply because it's harder to quantify, and that shouldn't be the case, of course. So I've seen this play out more than once. So, for example, a company spends significant management attention on a well-documented operational risk. Because the data is clean and the model just works, you can quantify it easily based on past data. While, on the other hand, a fundamental shift in its competitive environment is barely discussed. You know why? Not because people don't sense it, they do, but because it doesn't fit neatly into the risk framework in the risk quantification approach. And behind that sits a deeper assumption, let's say that the future will behave like the past, which we all know is just wrong in many cases. But then in many situations, that assumption just does not hold. Market shifts, so we know that technologies evolve very fast, regulation changes more than we like, in ways that historical data simply could not have anticipated. Mm-hmm. So the real question, Thomas, is not only what the data tells us, but also what has fundamentally changed. And that requires judgment. You can't do without judgment, not just calculation or quantification. And in that sense, good risk management combines like both data to understand the past and judgment to interpret the future. And quantification then creates value. So yes, I'm a fan of quantification, but only when it improves the decision, not per se. So, and not specifically not when it improves the appearance of rigor when there is none. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's highly interesting what you're saying, and quantification of risk is such a huge topic, as you mentioned also in so many organizations, and I probably go along the very similar lines as you and try to explain it also. Quantification makes sense in a certain context, but it can bring more danger, if you want to call it like this, in the sense of that you might forget to look at things that really matters.
Absolutely.
As you just mentioned. And it's all over the place. I hear this so often, quantification. And I probably try to say it's not wrong, right? But let's go one step back and let's think about what is our objective? What do we want to achieve? What are we as an organization? To what extent does it make sense? And how can we embed it in our risk framework in order to create value to our organization in what we are doing? And not just, as you also mentioned, just to build a beautiful model that looks great from the outside. And as we talk about that, there's always this story that comes to my mind. It's a couple of years back, but we went into a board meeting, and there was a member of the board of directors, and he was used to a quantified risk model of one of his other organization where he was in the board, and we presented a very clear risk report, but without quantification. Our quantification was based on professional judgment of experts. And then he was so released to see a risk report that was deeply founded, but much easier to read. And he kind of outed himself. I'm so happy to see this because I always struggle to understand this quantified risk report, and I don't dare to ask because I'm a board of directors. So it was really like an aha effect for me and for my career. Each and every single time you have the opportunity to get an opinion from a subject matter professional about how they see a potential impact and maybe also the likelihood that something might happen, but always keeping the focus on the impact, because that's what matters. That's what you need to have in the focus as a board and also as the executive board of an organization. So highly interesting.
Yes, Thomas, I second that. Absolutely.
So as this show is also about internal audit, I have to ask you a question about integration with internal audit and the future of risk management. So risk management does not operate in isolation, as you very well know, Stefan. How should it work together with, especially with internal audit and also other governance functions, to give management and boards a clear insights? And as technology and AI reshape the landscape so fast, how do you see the role of risk management evolving from there?
Good question. I think I'm taking the leadership perspective. So from this perspective, risk management, internal audit, and also compliance should not operate as separate conversations. Why should they? So they are different lenses on the same reality, actually. The question for me is not whether they overlap. It's more if the overlap creates clarity or noise. That's a huge difference.
Well said,
And
yeah.
yeah, in my experience, the real problem is not that they overlap. They do. That's okay. They have to do. But it's that they often do not talk to each other at all. So I've seen organizations where the risk function identifies, for example, a critical strategic risk around a major market shift, for example. Internal audit runs a completely separate review of the same area, and compliance is doing its own assessment in parallel. So 3 teams, same topic, 3 separate reports landing on the same desk, actually. And nobody in the room has a coherent picture. That's not a governance problem.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not a governance problem. It's more a communication problem. So, and it's surprisingly easy to fix if you're willing to start with one shared conversation instead of 3 separate ones. And if you take that a step further, looking ahead, I see 2 important developments. Allow me to explain briefly. So first, artificial intelligence, AI, will of course significantly enhance our analytical capabilities. Think about scenario analysis, for example, pattern recognition across large data sets, or even stress testing assumptions much, much faster than any human team could do. That's genuinely useful, but it will never replace judgment. Never. Hopefully never. So if anything, it will increase its importance because someone still has to decide which scenarios matter and what to do with the results. So the action that follows, actually. So AI will make bad risk management faster. The real question is whether organizations use AI to improve decision-making judgment or simply to scale bad reasoning. By the way, I've seen this several times. So second, we will see a shift from prediction to resilience. I know that's another buzzword, but still there's some truth in it. For some risks, the key question is no longer how likely something is, so talking about probabilities, right? But whether the organization can absorb if it happens or not. And that fundamentally changes the conversation too. And I think it's a healthier framing for leadership teams after all.
I like that part very much. So if risk management and internal audit and compliance are different lenses on the same reality as you just mentioned, what does good coordination between them actually look like in practice?
I think it's another good question. Important, not so easy to solve maybe in practice, but still, I think good coordination is again less about the structures. It's, let's say, more about clarity of roles and also having this like shared focus. So keep it simple. Each function should keep its strength, right? So risk management focuses on forward-looking uncertainty, not predicting, but analyzing potential uncertainty that lies in the future. Internal audit, on the other hand, provides assurance on whether things actually work. And last but not least, compliance ensures adherence to these rules. So now I think the problem arises when they operate in parallel without any, let's say, real connection. What tends to work well in practice is to align them around key decisions. Again, So I'm a fan of this decision-oriented risk management, key decisions, not only, and also key risks. So for example, let's just make an example, maybe that helps. If a company identifies a few strategic uncertainties, for example, market shifts, entering or launching a new product, cyber exposure can be strategic too, not only operational cyber, right? Or also regulatory change. Risk management can structure the forward-looking analysis. So that's a major task of risk management. Internal audit then can test whether controls and processes behind are actually robust, and compliance ensures that regulatory aspects are properly tackled and covered. So instead of having like these three separate conversations, you get more like an integrated view. And I really like that term, integrated. And most importantly, probably, Thomas, this does not require a complex governance structure. Often a simple, maybe a surprisingly simple coordination mechanism is enough. For example, a joint discussion at management level around a small number of top risks, key risks. Then the goal is not to eliminate overlap completely. So don't get me wrong. So the goal is just to make sure that different perspectives reinforce each other instead of creating noise or duplication.
I just would like to come back to the term that you just used, that you like the term integrated view. And I would like to bring this up again. And I kind of agree with you because I'm also a big believer in, let's call it integrated assurance. But what I experienced over the last couple of months when I had multiple conversations with C-level people in organization, also with board members. And the interesting thing for me was, as it's crystal clear for me what it means, integrated view, for them, in often cases, they got like a little bit confused and they thought integrated means everyone together. And it was because they appreciated like the different lens. And that's why I liked very much this shared view through different lenses. And that was like an eye-opener for me. Probably in my conversation over the coming weeks and months, I probably will use the term like a shared view or a shared assurance, because also from my experience, I'm a huge supporter that everything needs to start as a strategy. Then risk needs to understand the strategy and develops its risk approach. Internal control system needs to be aligned with the risks, and then internal audit very much aligned with the highest risk and very focused on what they're doing in close collaboration and discussion with the board to understand what's the value of internal audit or the perceived value in the organization. So it needs to be, and again, I really love that what you say, that this shared view through different lenses at what drives our organization to achieve, what's his mission and vision, what's the strategy to get there, and how we as governance function can support our organization, the board, the management to get there and provide insights, learnings, and certainly also assurance.
Absolutely.
Values. I really love your lens, the words you use, Stefan. There's hours and hours, if not years and years of thoughts that went into this to really shape your words, your thoughts, and to nail it down really to the point. So many, many thanks for that. So Stefan, that brings us to the end of our conversation. So thank you so much. I really think this was an amazing, highly interesting conversation. And probably what I take away of today's conversation, and please correct me if I got this wrong, but it's three main things. So first, risk management only creates real value when it shapes decision under uncertainty, not when it simply produces reports, registers, and productual comfort. And second, the organization that do this well are not necessarily the ones with the most sophisticated frameworks. They are the ones where risk thinking, it's the thinking that is embedded in decision, not reported after the fact. And third and last is that the future of risk management is not just better analytics, it's better judgment, stronger resilience, and much more closer integration with internal audit, compliance, and leadership decision overall to be made.
Great summary, Thomas. So maybe a last sentence from my side. Integrated risk management for me means it's a part of decision-making process in every company. It's not an isolated process. It also means that decisions actually drive methods, not vice versa. So the methods in risk management follows the decision at hand. And if you follow that simple principle, this is a game changer in practice. Unfortunately, there's quite a way to that because many organizations still run like an isolated framework or norm-based risk management process, completely isolated from the decision-making process. And that is a huge issue still in practice. But thank you very much, Thomas, for these questions, for this podcast. I really enjoyed the conversations I've had. Maybe to leave the listeners with one thought: risk management can create value. First of all, this is also well supported by empirical studies, but only again if it changes decisions. So everything else is like it's just process. It's a process without impact. Let's put it like this.
And Stefan, if our listeners liked what they hear today from you, where could they find you if they would like to connect with you and maybe find out a little bit more about your books that you wrote?
If listeners would like to connect, I think LinkedIn is probably the easiest way. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. And I also regularly share my thoughts on risk management decision making there. Thanks again, Thomas. It really was a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. I hope this episode gave you a fresh perspective on why modern risk management must do far more than maintain registers and produce reports. At its best, it should help organizations make better decisions, navigate uncertainty more consciously, and build resilience in a world that is only becoming more and more complex, as we all know. Make sure to subscribe to Governance Unplugged on your preferred podcast platform, and if there is any topic you would like us to explore, please drop me a message on LinkedIn. And as always, together, let's build stronger, more resilient organizations, one conversation at a time. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep driving governance excellence.